Welcome back, students, to the second presentation for our esports course. This time we're going to look at video games, the revolution, right? And we're going to ask a really big question. What's a video game? Right? Seems like an easy answer, but hey, let's make it complicated. So sit back, relax, and let's enjoy some esports. So, I want you to think about that companies, culture, all this good stuff had a life before computers and video games came out, right? So one of the biggest examples of this is Nintendo, right? It's been around for way over 100 years, starting in 1889. That's crazy, right? And Nintendo itself, fun fact, means leave luck to heaven. Who knew? Nintendo got its start making Hanafuda cards. These are little tiny cards, probably about 2/3 the size of a standard playing card, and they have flowers on them and are often called flower cards. They were used to gamble with and play other games as well. But one of the biggest proprietors or users of Hanafuda cards was the Yakuza. If you're not familiar with the Yakuza, they're basically like the Japanese mob. And they ran these underground casinos. Well, luckily for Nintendo, every single time you would play Hanafuda, you'd have to start out with a new deck to make sure no one was cheating. So you can imagine the Yakuzas are buying these Hanafuda cards in truckloads and making Nintendo some sweet, sweet bank, right? In '63, they renamed themselves. They removed the playing card company, right? And they just go Nintendo. But you should note that, in fact, Nintendo still makes Hanafuda cards. Now, they don't do them in the traditional way on tree bark like they used to, but you can head on over to Amazon and buy yourself a set of Hanafuda cards. And they still do tournaments and stuff like that. So kind of neat. But in '63, it's basically, I want to think of Nintendo like their teenage years. They were just trying out a bunch of weird stuff. They created a taxi company, love hotels. Yeah, pay by the hour. It's what you think it is. Thanks, Nintendo, right? And lots and lots and lots of toys. Well, what happens is they take the skills from creating toys and start to apply that for making game consoles and video games, right? And in about '72, they released one of their first products. Now, we're really going to jump into Nintendo later, but I just wanted to give you an idea that a lot of these companies had lives before they became video game companies, right? Not all of them. Another example is Sega. Sega used to be an American company that was importing pinball machines for service members into Japan. It was later bought by a Japanese company and become what we currently know as Sega. And we'll get to that rivalry between Nintendo and Sega as well. And even pinball machines. You know, you think of a video game arcade. There was arcades before video game arcades. And we'll get more into that when we start to talk about arcades directly. So here's a question. Put on your thinking caps, break out your smartphones and say, Alexa, Siri, okay Google, right? And ask it, what is the first video game? What do you get? What's your answer? There's a standardized answer, but I just wanted you to think about what is it, who made it, but why was it the first, right? That's something we need to kind of ponder. Why was it the first? Well, an important way to figure out if something is the first or not is to define it. So before we even ask this question, right, think about what is a video game. Okay, kind of pause the video, think about what is a video game and what was the first. Go ahead, Google around, search around, see what you find. Okay, deep breaths. Okay, pause it. Come on, pause the video already. Okay, did you look? Okay, moving on. So, maybe, probably not though, but maybe you came across the cathode-ray tube entertainment device as the first video game. This was created in 47 right? It's the first interactive electronic game. Now you see, I didn't say video game, because it might be a video game, but it might not. It's made by Goldsmith and Mann from the Dumont Laboratory. It was on an oscilloscope, probably no bigger than the screen of your phone, and it was round, of course. And what would happen is you would take this, basically like a film, and you put it over the screen and it had targets on it. And your job was to arc this little light to hit the targets, and then if you got it, would go, not no sound, but it would look like it had a little kind of beam. It would fuzz out, and this is really representing kind of explosions and shells and stuff like that. But it didn't use any computing power. It was mostly resistors and that kind of stuff. So if you're thinking in your head that, you know, a video game is something about a computer, or there's some processes, there's an algorithm behind it, then the cathode ray tube entertainment device, that's a long name, is not a video game to you. But some would argue that it is. I'd say maybe. It never went into production. It was super expensive. And honestly, it had no impact on the industry as a whole, the gaming industry. Now, that's important, because a lot of the first games we're going to talk about really didn't matter. It's kind of weird to think about that, but I'll talk more about why that is. Maybe algorithms are important, a way to interact and process information to kind of play with a computer. Then maybe Turbo Champ is yours. Maybe that's your first game. Most people would say no, because Turbo Champ was never really run by a computer. It was created by a man named Alan Turing. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's probably because you've heard of the Turing test. Now, the Turing test is basically this idea that if you can't tell the difference between an artificial intelligence and a human being while you're interacting with it, then what's it matter? Then the intelligence is the same as a human being. So that's kind of Turing. You also, fun fact, cracked the Enigma machine of the Nazi Party, allowing the Allies to snoop in on their communication, and probably shortened or allowed the Allies to win World War II. Hooray! And Alan Turing was, of course, hearkened as a hero and celebrated by his fellow Englishmen. Oh no, he was. What happened to Alan Turing, you ask? Alan Turing was chemically castrated. What? Yeah, he was gay, and gay was a no-no back then and illegal. He got found guilty, and the punishment was chemical castration. Yeah, literally saved us from the Nazis, and that's how we treat them. But I digress. Right? So this Turbo Champ was developed to play chess. I'm like, how do you segue back into this? But it was created in '78, before computers were even capable of running it. It was a very crude algorithm by our current standards, but quite sophisticated for its time, and can actually think 2 moves ahead. It was never programmed in the computer, but Alan played it by hand. So if algorithms are important to you, then maybe this one. Another possibility that gets us even closer is Kate's created in 1950, Bertie the Brain. Bertie the Brain was exhibited at the Canadian National Exhibit. It was basically this big conference on technology and allowed participants to play tic-tac-toe. Hugely successful, in the sense that there was lines out the door. People were like just mind blown. You imagine playing your first computer game and nobody's ever heard of something like that, and boom, you're playing against a computer. And it was really built to showcase his company's Adatron tubes more than it was computers. It was largely dismantled and forgotten, and the only way we really know about it, it was featured in Life magazine. That's where that picture came from. So far, we've got a cathode ray tube device, we got an algorithm, and we got kind of a computer without a screen, right? So the cathode-ray entertainment device might not be your definition of a video game because, well, it wasn't a computer. But Turbo Champ was kind of a computer or an algorithm without a computer. Birdie the Brain's pretty close. I can see the argument for that one, but it didn't have a digital display. So if you're talking about, well, you're interacting through a display, then maybe not. Also, I want you to think about this. If your definition of what a computer is can also fit an Etch-a-Sketch, yeah, that thing when you were a kid, you shake it up, it's silvery, you turn the knobs and you make little pictures and stuff, then maybe your definition needs some tweaks. So think about it. So if you're like, it's a screen where it has some controls, you can interact with it, well, that's an Etch-a-Sketch, man. And maybe Etch-a-Sketch is your first video game. I don't know. Something to think about. So keep in mind, how does your definition of what a video game kind of filter out what we know? Most of these early video games, if you can call them that, were produced to showcase computers, programs, or in the case of Birdie, a different way of using tubes, right? They were really one-offs. They were hand-built by a team of people, usually, to kind of show off what they're capable of. They weren't meant to be video games. They were just, it happened to be games, right? Because the public or companies or industries would be curious about it. They weren't really built to like sell video games. Nobody really thought, hey, let's create a video game industry. They're like, oh my gosh, these computers are awesome and we can totally use them in World War II, right? For calculating, for science, for research. But they can do these cool games and they're awesome. Try them out, right? And they were largely dismantled and forgot about. Actually, there's some clear evidence that we forgot about a lot of them, right? I just gave you kind of 3 key examples, but there was a lot of early video games that were lost to time, because these are expensive. They were hundreds of thousands of dollars to create these things. You're not going to be like, oh, let's just leave this $100,000 thing laying around so we can play tic-tac-toe. No, you're going to say like, okay, we're done with this thing. Let's take it apart and we can build a mainframe, right? So, it's sad but true, but we lost a lot of the early history of gaming because of this. There's some other examples, X's and O's, kind of similar to Birdie the Brain, but they actually had electronic screens. They were made pretty close at the same time. It was X's and O's and draughts, also known as checkers. These were programmed out. X's and O's was one of the first games to utilize memory storage. So if you think about memory and being able to store things on a computer or save your game, basically, maybe it's X's and O's. This was, but again, not made for a game. It was made to investigate human-computer interfaces. It was a rotary phone, and your answers would appear on the screen. So draughts is important because it was made for the Mark I computer. This is the first computer commercially available, so it could actually run on multiple systems. So if your definition said, well, multiple people can play it, it's just not a one-off, then maybe checkers is your man. So just some more examples. But probably when you Googled it, right? When you asked Siri or Alexa, what was the first video game? This is probably what they came up with. This is arguably the first video game that kind of meets a lot of the standards. It's Tennis for Two, designed by Higginbotham, the Brookhaven National Laboratory. It's the annual public gathering because they open up to it and they want to kind of showcase what they're doing. It was displayed on an oscilloscope, clear screen, 2 controllers. So if you talked about controllers as being important. And it was basically like a tennis court. You can see a video of this in our Moodle shell, a sideways image, and you just bounce the ball like tick, 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 back and forth over the net. There was a knob to adjust the angle of the ball and a button to press to hit it. Again, dismantled and forgotten about. But it was the first video game kind of created for pure entertainment purposes rather than some academic research or to showcase a commercial product. It was just made for the general public to have fun with. So Tennis for Two could have been, and for many people is arguably the first video game. But again, taken apart, forgotten about. Mainframe computing. Now, one of the biggest drawbacks is that the games existed on only one system. If that system got taken apart, upgraded, and changed, that means the game didn't exist anymore. But along comes the PDP-1 microcomputer. When I say microcomputer, I mean like the size of a car. Right? Before that, computers, took up literally rooms. There would be ducts for ventilation and cooling, but these were a little more compact, a little bit faster. They had a vector display system, graphics that we'll actually come to see in things like Asteroid and other video games, and they were cheap enough, $120,000, right, that some universities started to allow students to fiddle around with them when they're not being used for research. And usually this was like in the middle of the night. But hey, as college students, I know you don't sleep, right? Probably one of the first created for a mainframe was Space War, 1961 by Steve Russell at MIT. They got passed around. It was available outside of the MIT Institute because people took it with them. Because if you think about these are a bunch of computer geeks that are, freaking out about playing Space War. Basically, there's a moon in the middle. These two ships kind of circle around, and you fire a bullet, try and destroy your enemy before you smash into the sun. And they loved it. So when they got jobs after MIT, they oftentimes took this game with them. Russell never patented he never graduated from MIT, but arguably this is definitely one of the first video games. It had all the components and it even existed on multiple systems. So Space War, spark of an industry. All right, in the bottom right hand corner, you'll see kind of an emulator. If you're not familiar with an emulator, the original not around anymore, but somebody programmed what it probably looked like. This is an example of Galaxy Game, which is basically almost exactly like Space War. You see a moon or a star in the middle, kind of rotating around, firing. Up until the 1970s, games were mostly novelties, right? Primarily research institutions, but that changed in 71 with Galaxy Game. Now, most people say, well, the first video game out there was Pong. No. People that really know say, well, the first commercially available video game was Computer Space. We'll get to that in a minute. No. Now, the first real prototype is Galaxy Game 71 by Pitt and Tuck. And it was a first coin-operated computer game available to the public, right? The problem was it wasn't cheap. It was $20,000 for this thing. It's a high-end commercially available computer that they kind of adapted to play this. And what they quickly realized was, at a quarter a time, they're not making their money back at all. There's no way to get that $20,000 back in a reasonable amount of time at a quarter of a time. So they kind of gave up, basically, on creating the computer industry. But luckily, we come across Nolan Bushnell. Same year, but a little bit later, Bushnell and Dabney create Computer Space, again a knockoff of Space War, because these are all computer geeks, they know Space War. They had to go with some specialized hardware, but the computer only cost $4,000, much more reasonable, than compared to the Galaxy game. Synergy Engineering created it. Nutting Associates kind of put it together, and this was the first commercially available video game. Now, arguably the first coin-operated was Galaxy game, but this is the first that you can actually buy, right? Sold about 1,500 units. It looks awesome. Again, check our website. There's a little video about Fun Spot, which is like the American arcade. I got to make my trek to Mecca and go check that out. I haven't been yet, but super excited. Yeah, Space War looks awesome. But you know what? It was really hard to play. But then comes Pong, right? You can see basically it kind of looks like Tennis for Two, but instead of on the side, it's a top-down view. And it kept score, right? This is created by Alan Alcorn, third employee of Atari in '72. And it was mostly meant to be a training exercise, but they had a blast playing it. So they stuck it in a cabinet and test ran it in a bar. And they were literally getting calls from the bar because the thing was broken. It wasn't broken. The coin bin had filled up in a day or two, and they had to come out and empty the thing. They expected to wait weeks, right? There are stories of people waiting outside the bar to open just to rush in and play. Yeah. There's a little bit of issue with Pong, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about Magnavox and a lawsuit that happened. Because Ralph Baer was actually the father of video games, right? You think everybody thinks Bushnell. Bushnell was the father of the game industry, but Baer was thinking about video games since 1951. He worked for Sanders and Associates, and he developed a prototype. It's a multi-function or multiple game video game system in '67. That's crazy. This was termed the Brown Box. Its technical name was TV Game Unit Number 7. As a prototype, and it was licensed to Magnavox in '72. And Magnavox created the Magnavox Odyssey in '72, right as Pong was coming out. Crazy, right? But why did now here's the thing. The Odyssey had a game that looked exactly like Pong. Oh my gosh, how'd that happen? Well, turns out Nolan Bushnell had been at a conference and seen Pong. And he had Alcorn build it out for him, and they had a big lawsuit, you can imagine, over who owns the rights to that game. We'll talk a little bit more, but it was $100 for the Magnavox Odyssey. It came with several games, and they sold 100,000 units. That's pretty solid. It wasn't like a blockbuster success like the Atari we'll talk about, but it was hugely popular. People were confused. So if you head on over to the Moodle site, there's a video. It's an advertising video on the Odyssey. It's a couple minutes long, but it's literally explaining to people on like how to hook up the video game, what is a video game, that you don't just need a Magnavox TV, right, to run it. It'll run on any TV, and it has almost like a board game feel. There's all these other components and knickknacks, often called feelies. It's basically like a board game with a TV component to it, more than it is a video game. You can imagine like Xbox having to explain what a video game is and how to hook it up. But Magnavox had to do this because nobody had ever seen a home console before. This is unheard of. So it's a neat video. Go ahead and give it a look. So here's our early history of video games, kind of a nice timeline that takes us from Turbo Champ and Cathode-Ray tube entertainment device, Tennis for Two. You can see Space War, Brown Box, but really the industry started to take off in the early 70s. So 72 was huge, right? Magnavox Odyssey comes out, Pong comes out, and people are just really excited about the technology that's going on.